Thomas Mitchell stood frozen in his doorway, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame as 30 Native American warriors filled his front yard like a human wall of silence and determination. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their painted faces, and the only sound was the rhythmic thump of his maid Sarah's uneven footsteps as she limped toward the door behind him. For 3 years, he had lived in isolation on his Colorado ranch, speaking to no one but the woman who cleaned his house and cooked his meals. Now, as the lead warrior stepped forward with eyes that held both judgment and unexpected compassion, Thomas realized that his carefully constructed world of solitude was about to shatter in ways he never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that would change everything began like every other morning for them. Past 3 years at the Mitchell Ranch. Thomas Mitchell awakened in his massive 4-poster bed at exactly 5:30 a.m., as he had every day since returning from his wife's funeral in the spring of 1887. The bedroom that had once echoed with Catherine's gentle laughter now stood as a monument to his grief. Her belongings arranged exactly as she had left them, gathering dust like relics in a museum dedicated to a love that death had stolen away. Thomas was a man of imposing stature, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders that had been built by years of hard labor before his shipping business had made him wealthy enough to afford luxury. At 45 years old, his dark brown hair was streaked with premature silver, and his green eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from losing the only person who had ever truly mattered. His face, once quick to smile and laugh, had settled into lines of permanent sorrow that made him appear far older than his years. The Mitchell Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of some of the most beautiful land in Colorado Territory, with the Rocky Mountains providing a breathtaking backdrop that Thomas no longer bothered to notice. The main house was a testament to the prosperity he had achieved through his Denver-based shipping company, which had grown from a single wagon operation into a network that moved goods throughout the Western Territories. The 3-story Victorian mansion featured hand-carved woodwork imported from the East Coast, stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across polished hardwood floors, and furnishings that had cost more than most families earned in a decade. But wealth had proven powerless against the consumption that had slowly stolen Catherine's life, leaving Thomas with material possessions that felt like mockeries of the happiness they had once shared. The grand staircase where she had descended each morning in her silk dresses now stood empty and silent. The library where they had spent countless evenings reading together had become a place he avoided entirely. Even the kitchen, where Catherine had loved to experiment with new recipes despite having servants to do the cooking, felt haunted by memories too painful to endure. The transformation of Thomas Mitchell from successful businessman to reclusive widower had been gradual but complete. In the months following Catherine's death, he had systematically withdrawn from every aspect of his former life, selling his Denver mansion, relocating his business operations to managers he trusted, and retreating to the ranch that had been their weekend escape from city life. The social obligations that had once filled their calendar, charity galas, business dinners, cultural events, were abandoned as Thomas found himself incapable of pretending that life held any meaning without Catherine's presence. His business associates had initially been understanding, attributing his withdrawal to normal grief that would eventually run its course. But as months turned to years and Thomas remained absent from all social and professional activities, their patience had given way to concern and eventually to acceptance that the Thomas Mitchell they had known had effectively ceased to exist. The shipping company continued to operate successfully under competent management, generating income that Thomas no longer cared about spending. While he remained isolated on his ranch like a ghost haunting his own life, the ranch employees who had once known Thomas as a fair and engaged employer gradually left for other positions as it became clear that their presence reminded him too painfully of the years when he and Catherine had taken active interest in the property's operation. The stable hands who had maintained their prize horses departed when Thomas sold the animals rather than endure memories of riding with his wife across the mountain meadows. The gardeners who had helped Catherine cultivate her beloved flower gardens were dismissed when Thomas could no longer bear to see the roses she had planted with such care and enthusiasm. By the winter of 1889, only 3 people remained on the entire ranch: Thomas himself, his foreman Jake Richardson, and a young woman named Sarah Whitecloud, who served as housekeeper and cook. Jake was a grizzled veteran of frontier life who had worked for the Mitchell family for over a decade, understanding grief well enough to respect Thomas's need for solitude while ensuring that essential ranch operations continued without requiring the owner's direct involvement. Jake lived in a small cabin near the main house, maintaining the property and managing the cattle operation that provided minimal income to offset basic expenses. Sarah Whitecloud represented the most unusual aspect of Thomas's isolated existence, though he had given little thought to the circumstances that had brought her into his employment. She was a young Native American woman of perhaps 25 years, with long black hair that she kept braided and pinned back in a practical style that suited her role as domestic servant. Her heritage was obviously mixed with features that suggested both Native American and European ancestry, though Thomas had never inquired about her background or family history. What mattered to him was that she performed her duties with quiet efficiency while respecting his need for minimal interaction and conversation. Sarah's most noticeable characteristic was the pronounced limp that affected her left leg, causing her to walk with a halting, uneven gait that created a distinctive rhythmic sound as she moved through the house. The injury that caused her disability was clearly severe and long-standing, though again Thomas had never asked about its origin or whether it caused her pain. His self-absorption in grief had made him indifferent to the struggles or circumstances of others, including the woman who kept his household functioning and prepared his meals with careful attention to his preferences. The daily routine that governed life at the Mitchell ranch had become as rigid and unchanging as a religious ritual. Thomas would rise before dawn and dress in the simple work clothes that had replaced the fine suits he had worn during his business career. He would eat the breakfast Sarah prepared for him in silence, avoiding eye contact while she served his coffee and eggs in the dining room that had once hosted elaborate dinner parties for Denver's social elite. After breakfast, he would spend hours walking the property boundaries, checking fence lines and water sources. Not because such work was necessary. Jake handled all essential ranch management, but because physical activity provided temporary distraction from the constant ache of loss that had become his normal state of existence. Sarah's presence in the house was both essential and ghostly, as she moved through her cleaning and cooking duties with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible to Thomas's grief-clouded awareness. She arrived each morning at sunrise and departed each evening at sunset, maintaining the household with standards that honored the home's former grandeur while adapting to the reduced circumstances of its current occupant. The meals she prepared were simple but nourishing. The cleaning she performed was thorough but unobtrusive, and her interactions with Thomas were limited to the absolute minimum required for practical household management. The isolation that Thomas had created around himself was so complete that weeks would pass without him speaking more than a dozen words to another human being. Jake would report on ranch operations during brief weekly meetings that Thomas endured rather than welcomed, while Sarah's communications were limited to essential questions about meals, supplies, or household matters that required his approval. The Denver friends and business associates who had initially attempted to maintain contact had long since given up in the face of Thomas's consistent refusal to respond to letters or receive visitors. This self-imposed exile had created a bubble of silence and solitude that Thomas believed would protect him from further emotional pain, while allowing him to preserve his memories of Catherine without the intrusion of a world that continued functioning despite her absence. He had convinced himself that isolation was preferable to the alternative of pretending to care about business affairs, social obligations, or human relationships that could only disappoint him by failing to measure up to the perfect love he had lost. The ranch that had once been a source of joy and pride had become a fortress designed to keep the world at bay, with Thomas as its sole prisoner and guardian. The beautiful landscapes that surrounded him went unnoticed, the changing seasons passed without acknowledgement, and the passage of time was marked only by the gradual accumulation of dust on Catherine's belongings and the slow deterioration of a man who had chosen to stop truly living when the woman he loved had died. Yet beneath the carefully maintained surface of his controlled routine, something was stirring that Thomas himself did not recognize or understand. The complete isolation that had seemed to offer protection was beginning to create its own form of suffering, a loneliness so profound that it had started to crack the emotional barriers he had constructed around his heart. Though he would have denied it if asked, Thomas Mitchell was slowly discovering that grief shared in solitude becomes something different and potentially more destructive than grief experienced within the context of human community and connection. The signs of this internal shift were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who might have been paying attention. His walks around the property had begun to extend longer into areas he had previously avoided, as if some part of him was searching for something he could not name. His appetite, which had been minimal since Catherine's death, had started to improve slightly, suggesting that his body was preparing for demands that his conscious mind had not yet acknowledged. Most significantly, he had begun to notice details about Sarah's daily presence that had previously escaped his attention entirely. The careful way she arranged fresh wildflowers in Catherine's favorite vase, the gentle efficiency with which she maintained Catherine's sewing room, and the obvious pain she endured while performing her duties despite her physical disability. These observations created the first stirrings of curiosity about another person's circumstances that Thomas had experienced since his wife's death, though he remained unaware that his emotional isolation was beginning to develop cracks that would soon prove impossible to ignore. The fortress of grief he had constructed was about to face a challenge that would test its foundations and force Thomas to confront questions about human connection, responsibility, and the possibility that even the deepest sorrow might not justify complete withdrawal from the world of the living. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of October 15th, 1890, began with an unusual disturbance that penetrated even Thomas Mitchell's carefully maintained cocoon of indifference. As he sat at his solitary breakfast, mechanically consuming the eggs and toast that Sarah had prepared, an unfamiliar sound reached his ears, the thundering of multiple horses approaching the ranch at high speed. The sound was wrong, too urgent and purposeful for the occasional visits from neighboring ranchers or supply deliveries that Jake typically handled without involving Thomas in any discussions. Thomas set down his coffee cup and moved to the dining room window, pulling aside the heavy curtains that Catherine had selected during happier times. What he saw in the distance made his blood run cold. A group of at least 20 mounted men were riding hard toward his property, their dust cloud visible against the morning sky like a brown smudge across the horizon. Even from this distance, Thomas could see that these were not ordinary travelers or business associates. The riders moved with military precision, and something about their formation suggested hostile intent rather than social calls or commercial purposes. His first instinct was to find Jake Richardson and determine whether the foreman had any knowledge of who these men might be or what they wanted. Thomas strode through the house with more urgency than he had shown in years, calling out for his foreman, while Sarah's distinctive limping footsteps echoed from the kitchen where she was cleaning the breakfast dishes. The sound of her uneven gait, which had become as familiar and unremarkable as background noise, now seemed ominous in the context of approaching danger. "Jake!" Thomas shouted as he burst through the front door onto the wide veranda that overlooked the ranch's main approach road. "Jake, where are you? We've got riders coming, and they don't look friendly." The foreman emerged from the barn where he had been checking on the few remaining cattle that constituted the ranch's livestock operation. Jake Richardson was a man in his 60s whose weathered face and cautious movements spoke of decades spent surviving in frontier territories where danger could appear without warning. His expression as he squinted toward the approaching dust cloud was grim, suggesting that he recognized something about the riders that Thomas had missed. "Boss," Jake called as he hurried toward the house, his voice carrying a note of urgent concern that Thomas had never heard before. "Those riders, they're wearing badges. Looks like a posse, maybe federal marshals. And they're riding like they mean business." The word marshals hit Thomas like a physical blow, not because he had committed any crimes that might warrant federal attention, but because law enforcement officers traveling in such numbers suggested serious accusations that could destroy what remained of his carefully ordered existence. His shipping business had always operated within legal boundaries. His ranch activities were limited to basic cattle operations that posed no threat to anyone, and his isolation meant that he had no involvement in territorial politics or conflicts that might draw government scrutiny. "What could they possibly want with me?" Thomas asked, though the question was directed more to himself than to Jake. "I haven't done anything that would interest federal authorities. I barely leave the property. I don't associate with anyone who might be involved in illegal activities, and my business affairs are all handled through legitimate channels in Denver." Jake's response revealed knowledge that surprised Thomas and suggested that his foreman understood more about the ranch's circumstances than he had previously indicated. "Boss, I don't think they're coming for you. I think they're coming for Sarah." The statement was so unexpected and incomprehensible that Thomas stared at Jake for several seconds before the words registered fully. Sarah White Cloud, the quiet woman who cleaned his house and cooked his meals, seemed like the least likely person in Colorado territory to attract federal attention. She spoke little, kept to herself, performed her duties without complaint, and had never given any indication that she possessed secrets or connections that might interest law enforcement officials. "That's impossible," Thomas said flatly. "Sarah is just a housekeeper. She's been working here for over 2 years without any problems or unusual behavior. What could she possibly have done that would bring federal marshals to my ranch?" Jake's expression suggested that he had been dreading this conversation for months or possibly years, carrying information that he had hoped would never become relevant to ranch operations or Thomas's welfare. "Boss, there's things about Sarah's background that maybe you should have asked about when you hired her. Things that explain why she was so grateful for work that kept her isolated from towns and travelers." Before Thomas could demand a full explanation of Jake's cryptic comments, the approaching riders had drawn close enough for their identities and intentions to become unmistakably clear. The group consisted of 12 federal marshals, armed and equipped for serious law enforcement action, led by a tall man whose badge and bearing marked him as someone accustomed to commanding authority in dangerous situations. Their horses were lathered with sweat from hard riding, and their faces held the grim determination of men pursuing a fugitive they had been tracking for a considerable time. The lead marshal raised his hand to halt his men at the edge of Thomas's property, surveying the ranch buildings with the practiced eye of someone evaluating potential defensive positions and escape routes. When he spoke, his voice carried across the distance with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance and honest answers. "This is United States Marshal William Harrison," the man called out. "We're looking for a woman known as Sarah White Cloud, also known as Sarah Running Fox, wanted in connection with the deaths of 7 settlers in Wyoming Territory. We have reliable information that she's been working on this property. We need to speak with the owner of this ranch immediately." The words struck Thomas like lightning, each accusation more impossible than the last. Sarah White Cloud, the woman who limped through his house preparing meals and maintaining cleanliness with gentle efficiency, was being accused of multiple murders. The quiet, respectful person who had never shown the slightest sign of violence or aggression was apparently a fugitive wanted by federal authorities for crimes that seemed completely inconsistent with everything Thomas had observed about her character and behavior. "There must be some mistake," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction even as he spoke the words. "The woman working here couldn't possibly be involved in violent crimes. She's barely capable of walking normally, let alone committing the kind of offenses you're describing." Marshal Harrison's response revealed the depth of investigation that had led to this moment, providing details that shattered Thomas's assumptions about the woman who had been living and working in his house for over 2 years. Sarah Running Fox is the daughter of a Lakota war chief who was killed during the Indian Wars. She's wanted for her role in organizing retaliatory attacks against his settlers who were responsible for her father's death and the massacre of her family's band. The limp you mentioned was caused by a bullet wound she received during her escape from federal custody 3 years ago. The revelation transformed every interaction Thomas had experienced with Sarah, recontextualizing her quiet efficiency and careful respect as the behavior of someone hiding from pursuit rather than simply performing domestic duties. Her reluctance to engage in conversation, her obvious relief at finding employment that kept her isolated from public contact, and her careful attention to maintaining Thomas's routines without drawing attention to herself now seemed like the actions of a fugitive rather than a dedicated servant. "We know she's here," Marshal Harrison continued, his tone becoming more assertive as he prepared to take direct action. "We've been tracking her for months, following reports of a Native American woman with a distinctive limp who was seeking employment at isolated ranches. Your property matches the description of her likely hideout, and we have witnesses who can identify her if necessary." Thomas felt the foundations of his carefully controlled world shifting beneath him as he realized that his self-imposed isolation had made him an unwitting accomplice to harboring a federal fugitive. His lack of interest in Sarah's background, his failure to ask questions about her previous employment or personal history, and his general indifference to anything beyond his own grief had created a situation that could destroy his reputation and possibly result in criminal charges against him as well. Jake Richardson stepped forward, his expression suggesting that he had been expecting this confrontation and had prepared for the consequences of his silence about Sarah's true identity. "Marshal, Mr. Mitchell didn't know nothing about Sarah's past when he hired her. She needed work, she did good work, and he needed someone to keep house. He's been grieving his wife's death and wasn't asking questions about anybody's background." The foreman's defense provided little comfort to Thomas, who was beginning to understand that his emotional withdrawal from the world had made him vulnerable to manipulations and deceptions that more engaged individuals would have recognized and avoided. Sarah's employment at his ranch had not been the fortunate coincidence he had assumed, but rather a calculated decision by someone seeking the perfect hiding place among people who would not scrutinize her past or question her motivations. Marshal Harrison's response indicated that federal authorities had little sympathy for unwitting accomplices, regardless of their personal circumstances or emotional state. Ignorance of a fugitive's identity doesn't eliminate an employer's responsibility for harboring wanted criminals. "Mr. Mitchell, we'll need to search your property thoroughly and question everyone who's had contact with the suspect. This situation could result in federal charges against you unless you cooperate fully with our investigation." The threat of criminal prosecution added a new dimension of terror to Thomas's rapidly expanding understanding of how completely his life had spiraled beyond his control. The isolation that had seemed like protection from further emotional pain had actually made him vulnerable to dangers he had never considered, while his self-absorption and grief had prevented him from recognizing warning signs that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention to their circumstances. As the marshals prepared to surround the house and begin their search for Sarah, Thomas realized that the quiet woman who had maintained his household for over 2 years was about to disappear from his life just as suddenly and devastatingly as his wife's death had ended their marriage. But unlike Catherine's loss to consumption, Sarah's removal would represent his failure to protect someone who had depended on him for safety, even if that dependence had been based on deception rather than honest employment arrangements. Marshals moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out around the Mitchell ranch like a net designed to prevent any possibility of escape. Thomas watched in horrified fascination as these hardened law enforcement officers transformed his peaceful property into what resembled a military operation, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning every building, tree, and potential hiding place with the intensity of men who had hunted dangerous fugitives across half the continent. Marshal Harrison approached the main house with 2 of his deputies, their boots echoing hollowly on the wooden steps of the veranda where Thomas had spent countless solitary hours mourning his wife. The sound seemed to violate something sacred about the space, introducing an element of violence and confrontation that felt incompatible with the sanctuary Thomas had tried to create around his grief. "Mr. Mitchell," the marshal said, his tone professional but unyielding, "we need you to call Sarah White Cloud out of the house. Any attempt to warn her or help her escape will result in federal charges against you for aiding and abetting a known fugitive. We have warrants for her arrest and authorization to use whatever force is necessary to take her into custody." Thomas felt a strange protective instinct stirring within him, an emotion he had not experienced since Catherine's final illness, when he had fought desperately and futilely to shield her from the consumption that was stealing her life. The idea of federal marshals storming through his house with weapons drawn, potentially terrorizing or harming the woman who had quietly maintained his household during his darkest years, awakened something in him that had been dormant since his wife's death. "She's not a violent person," Thomas heard himself saying, though he immediately questioned the wisdom of defending someone whose true nature he obviously did not understand. "In all the time she's worked here, Sarah has never shown any signs of aggression or dangerous behavior. She's gentle, respectful, and hardworking. Whatever she may have done in the past, she's not a threat to anyone now." Marshal Harrison's expression suggested that he had heard similar defenses from other well-meaning employers who had been deceived by fugitives skilled in concealing their true identities and intentions. "Mr. Mitchell, Sarah Running Fox is responsible for the brutal deaths of 7 innocent settlers, including 2 children. She used her injury and apparently helpless condition to gain access to isolated homesteads, then coordinated attacks that left entire families dead. Her gentle behavior in your employment was an act designed to maintain her cover while she planned her next moves." The description of calculated violence perpetrated by someone Thomas knew as a limping housekeeper who arranged wildflowers and prepared careful meals seemed so fundamentally incompatible with his observations that he struggled to accept the marshal's account as accurate. Yet the federal officer's obvious familiarity with Sarah's methods and their confidence in her guilt suggested extensive investigation that had produced compelling evidence of her criminal activities. From inside the house came the distinctive sound of Sarah's uneven footsteps, the rhythmic pattern that had become as familiar to Thomas as his own heartbeat during the years of shared isolation. But now, instead of the comforting routine of domestic maintenance, those footsteps seemed to carry an ominous quality, as if each step might be part of some larger plan that Thomas had been too grief-stricken to recognize or understand. "Sarah," Thomas called through the open front door, his voice carrying a warning that he hoped she would understand, despite the marshal's presence. "There are some federal officers here who need to speak with you." They say they've been looking for you regarding some matters in Wyoming territory." The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence from within the house created a tension that seemed to electrify the air around the assembled law enforcement officers. Marshal Harrison raised his hand, signaling his men to prepare for immediate action, while Thomas found himself caught between loyalty to someone who had served his household faithfully and recognition that harboring a fugitive could destroy what remained of his life. When Sarah finally appeared in the doorway, Thomas was shocked by the transformation in her appearance and demeanor. The quiet, deferential woman he knew had been replaced by someone whose dark eyes held a fierce intelligence and wariness that spoke of years spent evading capture while planning revenge against those who had wronged her people. Her posture, despite the obvious pain from her injured leg, conveyed a dignity and strength that had been carefully hidden beneath the humble facade of domestic service. "Marshal Harrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying a calm authority that seemed completely inconsistent with her role as a domestic servant. "I wondered when you would finally track me to this place. Your persistence is admirable, though your understanding of justice remains as limited as ever." The marshal's response revealed the personal nature of his pursuit, suggesting that Sarah's case represented more than routine law enforcement to him. "Sarah Running Fox, you're under arrest for the murders of the Patterson family, the Browns, and little Emma Sullivan in Wyoming territory. You've led us on quite a chase, but your war against innocent settlers ends today." Sarah's laugh was bitter and devoid of any humor, containing depths of pain and anger that made Thomas realize how little he had understood about the woman who had shared his isolated existence for over 2 years. "Innocent settlers? Is that what you call the men who massacred my father's peaceful band while they slept? Is that what you call the soldiers who shot children trying to flee across the river? Your innocent settlers celebrated the scalps of my family members like trophies from a hunting expedition." The exchange revealed a cycle of violence and retaliation that extended far beyond Thomas's understanding of territorial conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes. Sarah's actions, while legally criminal, appeared to be motivated by a quest for justice that the official legal system had been unwilling or unable to provide. Her targets had not been randomly selected innocent victims, but specific individuals who had participated in the massacre of her family and tribal community. Marshal Harrison's jaw tightened as Sarah's words challenged the moral foundations of his pursuit, though his commitment to law enforcement remained unwavering. "Whatever wrongs may have been done to your people, murdering families in retaliation makes you a criminal, not a warrior seeking justice. The law applies to everyone, regardless of their grievances or their heritage. The law?" Sarah's voice rose with indignation that had been suppressed during years of hiding. "The same law that allowed my father's killers to collect bounties for Apache scalps. The same law that gave medals to soldiers who shot pregnant women. You speak of justice while defending a system that has never recognized my people as human beings deserving of protection." Thomas found himself witnessing a confrontation that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the territory he had inhabited without really understanding its history of violence and injustice. His comfortable isolation had insulated him from awareness of the ongoing conflicts between expanding white settlement and displaced Native American communities, conflicts that had created the circumstances leading to Sarah's transformation from victim to fugitive. As the verbal sparring continued between Sarah and Marshal Harrison, Thomas became aware of subtle movements among the other federal officers that suggested they were positioning themselves for immediate action. The marshal's strategy appeared to involve keeping Sarah talking while his men surrounded the house completely, eliminating any possibility of escape while gathering intelligence about potential accomplices or weapons caches. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said suddenly, turning to address Thomas directly for the first time since the marshal's arrival. "I owe you an apology for the deception I've practiced during my employment here. You provided me with safety and steady work when I desperately needed both, and I repaid that kindness by placing you in legal jeopardy through my presence." The sincerity in her voice created a painful contrast with Marshall Harrison's description of her as a calculating killer who used deception as a weapon against innocent victims. Thomas saw in Sarah's eyes the same kind of profound loss that he recognized in his own mirror each morning. The emptiness that comes from losing everything. That gives life meaning and purpose. "You were never anything but respectful and hardworking," Thomas replied, surprised by his own willingness to defend her despite the mounting evidence of her criminal activities. "Whatever you may have done elsewhere, you were no threat to me, or to anyone on this ranch. You kept my household running when I was incapable of caring for myself or anyone else." Marshall Harrison stepped forward, his patience with the emotional exchange clearly exhausted. "That's enough conversation. Sarah Running Fox, you will surrender yourself immediately and submit to federal custody. Any resistance will be met with appropriate force, and anyone who attempts to interfere with this arrest will face criminal charges." Sarah's response revealed the depth of her commitment to the path she had chosen, even in the face of certain capture and probable execution. "I will not surrender to men who call justice murder when it serves their interests. I will not be taken alive to face trial by the same people who celebrated the slaughter of my family." The declaration transformed the tense standoff into an immediate crisis as Sarah stepped backward into the house while Marshall Harrison shouted orders to his men to close the perimeter and prepare for armed resistance. Thomas found himself trapped between competing loyalties and moral obligations, uncertain whether protecting Sarah represented justice or criminal conspiracy, but increasingly convinced that her capture would represent another form of tragedy. In a situation where too many innocent people had already suffered and died, the sound of breaking glass from the rear of the house indicated that Sarah was attempting escape through a back window, while the marshal's coordinated response demonstrated their experience in handling desperate fugitives who preferred death to capture. Thomas realized that the next few minutes would determine whether the woman who had quietly maintained his household would die violently on his property, adding another layer of loss and trauma to a life that had already been devastated by grief. Beyond his capacity to bear, the crash of shattering glass from the kitchen window galvanized the federal marshals into immediate action, their careful perimeter dissolving into chaos as half the men rushed toward the rear of the house while others maintained positions to prevent Sarah from circling back toward the front entrance. Thomas found himself standing alone on his veranda with Marshall Harrison, watching his peaceful ranch transform into a battlefield where a desperate woman fought for her freedom against overwhelming odds. "Stay here and don't interfere," Harrison commanded, drawing his weapon as he prepared to join the pursuit. "Any attempt to help her escape will result in federal charges that could send you to prison for the rest of your life." But Thomas was no longer the passive, grief-stricken man who had allowed the world to happen around him for the past 3 years. Something fundamental had shifted inside him during the confrontation with Sarah, awakening protective instincts and moral clarity that had been dormant since Catherine's death. The injustice of the situation, a woman seeking revenge for her family's massacre, being hunted by the same system that had sanctioned that massacre, struck him as profoundly wrong in ways that demanded action regardless of personal consequences. Instead of remaining safely on the veranda as ordered, Thomas circled around the side of his house, using his intimate knowledge of the property to move quickly through areas where the marshals had not yet established complete coverage. His destination was the root cellar that he and Catherine had built during their early years at the ranch, a hidden storage space that could provide temporary sanctuary for someone fleeing immediate pursuit. The sound of gunfire erupted from behind the house, followed by shouts and the thundering of horses as marshals attempted to cut off Sarah's escape routes. Thomas's heart pounded with a combination of fear and purpose that he had not experienced since his business days, when critical decisions had required Immediate action despite incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. He reached the concealed entrance to the root cellar just as Sarah emerged from a stand of aspen trees, her limp more pronounced as she pushed her injured leg beyond its normal limits in desperate flight. Blood stained her dress where a bullet had grazed her shoulder, and her face showed the strain of pain and exhaustion, but her eyes still held the fierce determination that had sustained her through years of pursuit and hiding. "This way, Thomas," called in a low voice, gesturing toward the hidden entrance that was camouflaged by careful landscaping. "There's a place you can hide until they give up searching the immediate area." Sarah's expression showed surprise and suspicion at this unexpected offer of assistance from someone who had every reason to distance himself from her criminal activities. "Why would you help me? You heard what they said about the people I killed. You know that harboring me makes you an accessory to murder in their eyes." Thomas's response surprised him as much as it did Sarah, revealing convictions that he had not known he possessed until forced to articulate them under pressure. "Because what you did was justice, not murder. Those men slaughtered your family and celebrated their deaths like hunters displaying trophies. If the law won't provide justice for such crimes, then maybe justice has to come from other sources." The philosophical discussion was interrupted by the approach of pursuing marshals, their voices carrying clearly through the thin mountain air as they coordinated their search patterns and reported on tracks and signs of Sarah's passage. Thomas quickly ushered her into the root cellar, a space that had been designed to store food through harsh winters, but which now served as a sanctuary for someone fleeing what she clearly considered unjust persecution. The cellar was larger than its concealed entrance suggested, with shelving that held preserved foods and supplies that Thomas had accumulated during his years of isolation. More importantly, it included a ventilation system that provided fresh air without creating obvious external signs of habitation, and a secondary exit that emerged near the creek bed where water sounds would mask any noise from someone leaving the hiding place. "There's food and water here," Thomas explained quickly as Sarah settled into the hidden space, her injury obviously causing significant pain. "The secondary exit leads to the creek about 50 yards downstream from the main house. If you follow the water north for about a mile, you'll reach a trail that connects to the main road toward Denver." Sarah's response revealed the depth of her exhaustion and the cost of her years spent fleeing federal pursuit. "I can't keep running forever. My leg makes it impossible to travel the distances necessary to stay ahead of organized pursuit, and the pain is getting worse each year. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and accept whatever punishment they believe I deserve." The resignation in her voice sparked something protective in Thomas that reminded him of his helpless rage during Catherine's final illness, when he had been forced to watch someone he cared about suffer while feeling powerless to provide meaningful assistance. But unlike his wife's battle with consumption, Sarah's situation involved human enemies who could be resisted and circumstances that might be changed through courage and intelligent action. "You're not giving up," Thomas said firmly. "Not after surviving this long and coming this close to real freedom. I have connections in Denver, business associates who owe me favors and who might be able to help you disappear permanently or even clear your name, if the right evidence can be presented to federal authorities." The offer was made impulsively, without careful consideration of the practical difficulties or personal risks involved. But Thomas found himself committed to helping Sarah escape, not just immediate capture, but the cycle of pursuit and hiding that had defined her existence since her family's massacre. His isolation had made him forget the satisfaction that came from using his resources and capabilities to help others, a reminder of the man he had been before grief transformed him into a recluse. Sarah studied his face carefully, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives that might explain his willingness to risk everything for someone he had known, primarily as a domestic servant. "You don't understand what you're offering. These marshals won't give up easily, and anyone who helps me will become a target for federal investigation. Your comfortable isolation will be destroyed, and you could face years in prison for harboring a fugitive." Thomas's response revealed how completely his perspective had changed during the morning's crisis, as he recognized that his self-imposed exile had been a form of cowardice rather than the protective measure he had believed it to be. "My isolation was never as comfortable as I pretended. I've been hiding from life instead of living it, using grief as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for anything or anyone beyond my own pain. Maybe it's time to start caring about something larger than my personal suffering." The sound of approaching footsteps and voices indicated that the marshal's search was moving closer to their hiding place, requiring immediate decisions about Sarah's next moves and Thomas's level of involvement in her escape. Through the cellar's ventilation system, they could hear Marshal Harrison coordinating his men's efforts and expressing frustration at their failure to capture a wounded woman in unfamiliar territory. "She's injured and on foot," the marshal was saying to his deputies. "There's no way she can get far enough to avoid capture if we maintain systematic coverage of all possible escape routes. Check every building, every cave, every place where someone could hide until we're gone." Sarah's whispered response to the overheard conversation revealed her intimate knowledge of law enforcement tactics and her understanding of the futility of trying to evade a determined, well-organized pursuit. "They're right. Even with your help, I can't outrun mounted men across open country with this injury. The best I can hope for is to avoid capture long enough to die on my own terms, rather than facing execution after a show trial." But Thomas had spent years successfully managing complex logistics for his shipping business, coordinating transportation and supply networks across vast distances under challenging conditions. His mind began working on Sarah's escape problem. With the same analytical approach he had once applied to moving valuable cargo through hostile territory, while minimizing risks and maximizing efficiency. "What if we don't try to outrun them?" he suggested quietly. "What if we make them think you've escaped in one direction, while actually moving you to safety somewhere they wouldn't think to look? I have business connections throughout the territory, including some who operate in areas where federal authority is limited and local loyalties are stronger than federal law." The plan that emerged from their hurried consultation was audacious in its simplicity and dependent on Thomas's willingness to commit fully to deception that would make him a permanent enemy of federal law enforcement. He would create evidence suggesting that Sarah had stolen one of his horses and fled toward the Mexican border, where many fugitives sought sanctuary beyond the reach of American legal authority. Meanwhile, she would actually be hidden in Denver until arrangements could be made for permanent relocation to a place where her identity could be completely reinvented. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked again, still struggling to understand Thomas's transformation from indifferent employer to committed ally. "What do you gain from helping someone whose presence has already brought federal marshals to your peaceful ranch?" Thomas's answer came from a place of self-knowledge that he had not accessed since Catherine's death, revealing motivations that surprised him with their clarity and conviction. "I gain the chance to be useful again, to protect someone who deserves protection instead of hiding behind grief like a coward. Catherine would be ashamed of the man I've become, but maybe she'd be proud of the man I could still choose to be." The implementation of Thomas's escape plan required precise timing and theatrical deception that tested every skill he had developed during his years of managing complex business operations under pressure. While Sarah remained hidden in the root cellar, Thomas emerged from his concealed position and walked directly toward the group of marshals who were systematically searching his property, his expression carefully arranged to display the shocked confusion of a man whose peaceful existence had been shattered by unexpected violence. "Marshal Harrison," Thomas called out as he approached the federal officers, his voice carrying just the right note of panicked urgency. "I think I saw her heading toward the stable. She was limping badly and bleeding from what looked like a shoulder wound, but she seemed to be trying to reach the horses. The marshal's immediate response demonstrated his professional skepticism about information provided by civilians during active fugitive pursuits, though Thomas's apparent cooperation and obvious distress suggested genuine rather than calculated assistance. You saw Sarah running fox near your stable? When exactly and which direction was she moving? Thomas's fabricated account was delivered with the kind of specific detail that lent credibility to false testimony, drawing on his intimate knowledge of the ranch layout to create a plausible narrative that would redirect the marshal's search efforts away from Sarah's actual hiding place. Maybe 10 minutes ago, just after I heard the gunshots from behind the house. She was moving toward the corral where I keep my riding horses, staying low and using the barn as cover. It looked like she was planning to steal a horse for her escape. The information prompted immediate action from Marshal Harrison, who dispatched half his men to surround the stable complex, while ordering others to check for missing animals or evidence of forced entry into the tack room where saddles and bridles were stored. Thomas followed the marshals toward the stable, maintaining his facade of helpful cooperation while inwardly calculating whether Sarah would have sufficient time to reach the secondary exit from the root cellar before the search expanded to include areas near the creek. What the marshals discovered at the stable appeared to confirm Thomas's account while providing evidence that Sarah running fox possessed both the desperation and practical skills necessary for successful escape from immediate pursuit. One of Thomas's fastest horses was missing from its stall, along with a saddle and bridle that had been taken with professional efficiency despite the obvious haste required to avoid capture. More importantly, there were clear tracks leading away from the stable toward the southern boundary of the ranch, where rough terrain would make pursuit difficult, but not impossible for experienced federal officers. She's got maybe a 20-minute head start, Marshal Harrison observed as he studied the tracks and estimated the time required for Sarah to saddle and mount the stolen horse. But she's injured, unfamiliar with the animal, and heading into country where we can use our superior numbers to cut off her escape routes. We'll split into 3 groups and fan out along the likely paths toward the Mexican border. Thomas watched the marshals organize their pursuit with professional admiration for Sarah's apparent foresight in creating such convincing evidence of her escape route, though he knew that the missing horse and fabricated tracks represented his own handiwork rather than her criminal ingenuity. During the chaotic minutes while the federal officers had been searching the rear of his property, Thomas had quickly released his fastest gelding and driven the animal south while creating false tracks that would suggest Sarah's passage through areas where mounted pursuit would be both difficult and time-consuming. The success of the deception depended on the marshals' assumption that a wounded fugitive would prioritize immediate escape over elaborate misdirection, making them likely to follow obvious trail signs rather than conducting the systematic search that might have revealed Sarah's actual hiding place. Thomas's knowledge of law enforcement psychology, gained through years of protecting valuable shipments from criminals who used similar tactics, had suggested that federal officers would expect desperate flight rather than calculated deception from someone facing immediate capture. As the marshals prepared to mount their horses and begin pursuit along Sarah's apparent escape route, Thomas experienced a moment of profound anxiety about whether his plan would prove sufficient to ensure her safety or merely delay her capture by a few hours. The realization that he had committed himself to a course of action that made him a federal fugitive as surely as Sarah herself was both terrifying and oddly liberating, representing the first consequential decision he had made since Catherine's death. "Mr. Mitchell," Marshal Harrison said as he swung into his saddle, "we'll need you to remain available for further questioning about your employee's activities and any possible accomplices she may have had during her time on your property. Don't leave the ranch until we've completed our investigation and determined whether criminal charges will be filed against you for harboring a fugitive." The marshal's warning contained an implicit threat that Thomas understood perfectly, though he also recognized that federal authorities would be unlikely to pursue charges against him aggressively if they succeeded in capturing Sarah and closing her case. His cooperation in providing information about her escape route would weigh in his favor, while his obvious shock at learning about her criminal background would support his claims of unwitting involvement in harboring a wanted fugitive. "Of course, Marshal," Thomas replied with what he hoped appeared to be appropriate deference to federal authority. "I'll be available whenever you need to speak with me about this situation. I'm as eager as you are to see justice done and to understand how I became involved in harboring someone wanted for such serious crimes." The departure of the federal officers in pursuit of Sarah's false trail provided Thomas with his first opportunity to assess the success of his deception and begin the next phase of his plan to ensure her permanent escape from federal pursuit. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before returning to the root cellar, where Sarah had spent the past hour listening to the marshals' search activities while wondering whether Thomas's scheme would prove adequate to fool experienced law enforcement officers. "They've taken the bait," Thomas reported as he helped Sarah emerge from the cramped hiding space, noting that her shoulder wound appeared to have stopped bleeding, though her face showed obvious pain from the injury and the stress of prolonged concealment. They're heading south toward the Mexican border, following tracks that should keep them occupied for at least a full day before they realize they've been deceived. Sarah's expression revealed a mixture of gratitude and amazement at the effectiveness of Thomas's impromptu escape plan, though her years of experience evading capture had taught her to remain cautious about premature celebrations of apparent success. "How did you create convincing evidence of my escape?" The marshals seemed confident they were following genuine trail signs rather than elaborate misdirection. Thomas's explanation of his deception revealed planning skills and attention to detail that impressed someone whose survival had depended on successfully misleading federal authorities for over 3 years. "I released one of my horses and drove it south while creating tracks that would suggest you had stolen it for your escape. The animal is trained to return home, so it will probably show up here in a day or two, but by then you'll be safely hidden in Denver, and the marshals will be searching hundreds of miles away." The practical challenges of moving Sarah from the ranch to Denver without attracting attention required careful coordination with Jake Richardson, whose knowledge of local transportation networks and trustworthy contacts would be essential for successful execution of the escape plan. Thomas had initially worried that his foreman might refuse to participate in activities that would make him an accessory to harboring a fugitive, but Jake's response revealed long-standing sympathy for Sarah's situation and anger at the federal government's treatment of Native American communities. "I've been knowing about Sarah's real identity for months," Jake admitted when Thomas explained the situation and requested his assistance. "She told me about her family and what happened to them because she needed someone to understand why she might have to disappear suddenly. What those settlers did to her people was pure murder, and if the law won't provide justice, then maybe justice has to come from other directions." The foreman's support provided crucial additional resources for Sarah's escape, including contacts with freight wagon operators who moved goods between isolated ranches and Denver's commercial district without asking detailed questions about their occasional human passengers. Jake's decades of experience in frontier territory had created a network of relationships with people who understood the necessity of sometimes bending official rules to serve human needs that the law failed to address adequately. "There's a freight outfit runs supplies to mining camps up in the mountains," Jake explained as he outlined transportation options that would move Sarah away from the ranch without creating records that federal authorities could trace. "The driver owes me favors from when I helped him out of trouble with claim jumpers a few years back. He can take Sarah to Denver hidden among his cargo, and nobody's gonna ask questions about what he's carrying as long as his paperwork looks legitimate." The coordination required for Sarah's escape revealed organizational capabilities that Thomas had not exercised since his active involvement in shipping operations, awakening skills and instincts that had been dormant during his years of grief-induced isolation. The challenge of moving a wanted fugitive safely through territory, crawling with federal officers while maintaining the deception that would protect all participants, required the same kind of logistics planning and risk assessment that had made his business successful. As evening approached and preparations for Sarah's departure neared completion, Thomas found himself experiencing emotions that he had not felt since Catherine's death, the satisfaction of protecting someone who mattered to him, the excitement of taking meaningful action despite significant personal risks, and the sense of purpose that came from using his capabilities to serve causes larger than his own comfort and security. Freight wagon that would carry Sarah to safety arrived at the Mitchell Ranch just before midnight, its driver a grizzled veteran of frontier transportation named Marcus Webb, who had spent 20 years moving cargo through territories where discretion was often more valuable than speed. Webb's weathered face and calculating eyes spoke of a man who had learned to evaluate risks carefully while maintaining the flexibility necessary to adapt when circumstances demanded creative solutions to transportation challenges. Jake tells me you need passage to Denver for someone who values privacy, Webb said to Thomas as they met beside the darkened wagon, his voice pitched low to avoid carrying beyond their immediate vicinity. I don't ask questions about my passengers' business, but I need to know if this cargo is likely to attract the kind of attention that could endanger my regular operations. Thomas's response required delicate balance between honesty about the risks involved and confidence that would persuade Webb to accept the dangerous assignment. The passenger is someone who has attracted federal interest, but the authorities currently believe she's traveling in the opposite direction. If we can get her to Denver without incident, the risk to your operations should be minimal because the search will be focused hundreds of miles away. Webb's professional assessment of the situation revealed experience with similar assignments that had taught him to distinguish between manageable risks and potentially catastrophic exposure to federal prosecution. Federal attention means serious money and serious consequences if things go wrong. My standard rate for this kind of work is $50 plus expenses, with an additional $100 if we encounter any complications that require special handling. The financial terms were steep, but not unreasonable for transportation that could result in federal charges against everyone involved if the operation was discovered and traced back to its organizers. Thomas accepted Webb's conditions without negotiation, recognizing that the freight operator's expertise and established routes provided Sarah's best chance for reaching Denver safely while avoiding the systematic searches that federal marshals would be conducting along main roads and obvious travel corridors. Sarah's preparation for the journey revealed both her practical intelligence and the physical toll that years of constant vigilance had taken on her health and stamina. Her shoulder wound had been cleaned and bandaged, but the injury clearly caused significant pain that would be exacerbated by hours of cramped concealment in the freight wagon's hidden compartment. More concerning was the obvious exhaustion that shadowed her eyes, suggesting that her body was approaching the limits of endurance after sustaining the stress of pursuit and hiding for over 3 years. The compartment is designed for smuggling high-value cargo through territories where bandits operate, Webb explained as he showed Sarah the concealed space that would hide her during the journey to Denver. It's not comfortable, but it's virtually undetectable even during thorough searches by people who know what to look for. You'll have water and some food, plus a small air vent that provides adequate ventilation without creating obvious external signs. The hidden compartment was ingeniously constructed within the wagon's floor, accessible through a panel disguised to look like part of the standard cargo platform. Sarah would be concealed beneath legitimate freight consisting of mining equipment and supplies destined for commercial establishments in Denver, creating perfect cover for transportation that would appear routine to any federal officers who might inspect the wagon during its journey. As Sarah prepared to enter the cramped hiding space that would be her world for the next 18 hours, she turned to Thomas with an expression that revealed the depth of her gratitude for his willingness to risk everything to ensure her freedom. "I don't understand why you chose to help me when doing so could destroy everything you've built here, but I will never forget what you've done. If I survive this journey and manage to disappear successfully, your courage will be the reason." Thomas's response surprised him with its emotional honesty, revealing feelings that he had not fully acknowledged even to himself during the crisis that had transformed his life over the past day. "Helping you has reminded me what it feels like to care about something larger than my own grief. For 3 years, I've been living like a ghost, existing without purpose or connection to anything meaningful. Your presence forced me to remember that there are still injustices worth fighting and people worth protecting." The farewell between Thomas and Sarah was brief but profound, marking the end of a relationship that had begun with employer and servant, but had evolved into something approaching genuine partnership and resistance against systemic oppression. Sarah's transformation from quiet housekeeper to revealed fugitive had paralleled Thomas's evolution from isolated widower to active protector, creating bonds forged in crisis that would endure regardless of whether they ever encountered each other again. Webb's departure with his concealed passenger occurred without incident, the freight wagon disappearing into the darkness along routes that avoided main roads while maintaining schedules that would bring Sarah to Denver during the busy morning hours when commercial traffic provided perfect camouflage for unusual cargo. Thomas watched until the wagon's lanterns vanished completely, then returned to his house with the strange sensation that his life had fundamentally changed in ways that could never be reversed. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's escape required careful attention to maintaining the deception that would protect everyone involved if federal marshals returned to investigate inconsistencies in their pursuit of the false trail. Thomas spent the early morning hours creating additional evidence that would support his account of Sarah's theft of his horse and flight toward Mexico, including damaged tackroom locks and scattered equipment that suggested hasty preparation for immediate departure. Jake Richardson proved invaluable during this phase of the operation, using his knowledge of tracking and evidence interpretation to ensure that any forensic examination would confirm rather than contradict the false narrative they had constructed. "Marshals who come back looking for holes in our story are going to find exactly what we want them to find," Jake assured Thomas as they completed their preparations. "Every detail supports the idea that Sarah stole your horse and headed south. And there's nothing here that suggests she had help or went in any other direction." The return of Marshal Harrison and his deputies 3 days later provided the crucial test of whether their deception would withstand professional scrutiny from experienced law enforcement officers who had discovered the limitations of pursuing false trails through difficult terrain. The marshal's expression as he dismounted from his exhausted horse suggested frustration with the futility of chasing a wounded fugitive who had apparently vanished without trace in the vast wilderness near the Mexican border. "We lost her trail in the rocky country about 30 miles south of here," Harrison reported to Thomas with obvious irritation at his failure to capture Sarah running fox despite having superior numbers and resources. "The terrain is perfect for someone who knows how to hide their tracks, and she apparently had enough of a head start to reach areas where mounted pursuit becomes impractical." Thomas's response was carefully calibrated to display appropriate concern while avoiding any suggestion that he possessed knowledge about Sarah's actual whereabouts or escape methods. "I'm sorry to hear that she got away, Marshal. I was hoping you'd be able to capture her and get some answers about why she chose to hide on my property. This whole situation has been very disturbing for someone who thought he was simply employing a reliable housekeeper." The marshal's investigation of the ranch focused primarily on gathering additional evidence about Sarah's activities during her employment and any possible contacts she might have maintained with accomplices or supporters who could have assisted. Her escape. Thomas answered all questions with studied honesty about the limited interactions he had experienced with Sarah, emphasizing his grief-induced isolation and lack of interest in his employees, personal backgrounds, or outside relationships. Did Sarah ever receive mail or visitors during her time working here? Harrison asked as he reviewed notes from his previous interviews with Thomas and Jake. Any indication that she maintained communication with people who might have helped her plan her escape or provided resources for extended flight? Thomas's negative responses to these inquiries were technically accurate, since Sarah had indeed maintained no obvious outside contacts during her employment, though he carefully avoided mentioning his growing suspicions that her isolation had been calculated strategy rather than simple preference for privacy. She kept to herself completely, Marshall. No visitors, no mail, no conversations about family or friends elsewhere. I assumed she was simply someone who preferred solitude, which suited my own circumstances perfectly. The Marshal's final assessment of the situation reflected his professional judgment that Sarah Running Fox had successfully evaded capture through a combination of desperate courage, intimate knowledge of wilderness survival, and favorable terrain that maximized her advantages while minimizing the effectiveness of organized pursuit. His recommendation that the case remain active but receive reduced priority suggested that federal resources would be redirected toward more promising investigations, while maintaining alertness for any future sightings or intelligence about Sarah's whereabouts. We'll keep the warrants active and maintain communication with Mexican authorities in case she surfaces south of the border, Harrison explained as he prepared to depart from the ranch. But realistically, a smart fugitive with a 3-day head start in that kind of country could disappear for years if she's careful about avoiding contact with law enforcement or government officials. Thomas's relief at the Marshal's departure was tempered by awareness that his involvement in Sarah's escape had permanently altered his relationship with federal authorities and his status within the territorial legal system. Though no charges had been filed against him, his association with a wanted fugitive would ensure ongoing scrutiny of his activities and connections that could complicate any future business dealings or social relationships requiring official approval or cooperation. 6 weeks had passed since Sarah's escape when Thomas first noticed the signs that someone was watching his ranch from the forested hills that surrounded his property. The observations began as subtle anomalies that might have been dismissed by someone less attuned to the rhythms of his isolated domain bird calls that seemed out of place for the season, shadows that moved differently than wind-blown vegetation, and the occasional glint of metal or glass from positions where no legitimate travelers would have reason to pause. Thomas's newfound alertness to his surroundings represented one of many changes that had transformed his daily existence since choosing to help Sarah escape federal pursuit. The grief-stricken recluse who had lived like a ghost for 3 years had been replaced by someone whose senses were sharpened by awareness that his actions had consequences, extending far beyond his personal comfort and security. The protective instincts awakened during Sarah's crisis had not subsided with her departure, but had instead evolved into constant vigilance against threats that might endanger anyone connected to his decision to harbor a fugitive. Jake Richardson had noticed the surveillance as well, his decades of frontier experience making him sensitive to signs that their property was being observed by individuals with purposes that were unlikely to be benign. "Boss, we got watchers in the timber above the north pasture," Jake reported during one of their evening discussions about ranch security. "Been there for at least a week, moving positions every few days, but maintaining visual coverage of the main house and approach roads." The presence of unknown observers created multiple possibilities that Thomas found equally disturbing. Federal marshals might have returned to conduct covert surveillance in hopes of intercepting communications or visitors that would reveal Sarah's whereabouts or expose the network that had facilitated her escape. Alternatively, The Watchers might represent bounty hunters attracted by rewards offered for information leading to Sarah's capture, individuals whose methods would be less constrained by legal procedures than federal law enforcement officers. Most concerning was the possibility that the surveillance represented advance reconnaissance by associates of Sarah's original victims, relatives or friends of the murdered settlers who sought private vengeance against anyone connected to the woman they held responsible for their losses. Thomas's assistance in Sarah's escape would make him a legitimate target for retribution in the eyes of people who viewed her as an unpunished killer rather than someone seeking justice for her family's massacre. "I've been thinking about those folks watching us," Jake continued as they discussed their options for dealing with unknown surveillance. "If they were federal officers, they would have approached directly by now instead of hiding in the woods like bandits. My guess is we're dealing with people who don't want their interest in this property to become part of any official record." The analysis suggested that Thomas faced a more immediate and personal threat than additional legal complications from his role in harboring a federal fugitive. Private individuals seeking vengeance or bounty would be less predictable and potentially more dangerous than law enforcement officers who operated within established procedures and accountability structures. The isolation that had once provided protection from unwanted attention now represented vulnerability to people whose intentions could not be anticipated or addressed through normal legal channels. Thomas's response to the surveillance threat revealed how completely his perspective on risk and responsibility had changed since Sarah's crisis had forced him to choose between safety and moral obligation. Instead of retreating further into isolation or seeking federal protection that would require betraying Sarah's trust, he began preparing to defend his property and anyone who might seek sanctuary there in the future. "We need to know who these people are and what they want," Thomas told Jake as they developed plans for identifying their watchers. "If they represent ongoing threats to this ranch or to anyone connected to Sarah's escape, we need intelligence. That will help us respond appropriately to whatever they're planning." The reconnaissance mission that Jake undertook to identify their surveillance required skills honed through years of tracking wildlife and avoiding hostile Native American war parties during his younger days on the frontier. Moving through familiar terrain with the stealth of someone whose survival had often depended on remaining undetected, Jake was able to approach close enough to the Watchers' positions to gather detailed information about their numbers, equipment, and apparent objectives. What Jake discovered during his covert observation was both reassuring and ominous in ways that Thomas had not anticipated. The surveillance team consisted of 6 Native American warriors whose dress, weapons, and tactical methods identified them as members of the same Lakota band that had produced Sarah, running Fox rather than enemies seeking vengeance or federal agents conducting investigation. The Watchers appeared to be Sarah's own people, monitoring the ranch for reasons that remained unclear but were unlikely to involve hostile intentions toward Thomas or his property. "They're Lakota, probably from Sarah's father's band," Jake reported after returning from his reconnaissance mission. "Well-armed and disciplined, but not positioned for attack. Looks more like they're gathering information or waiting for something specific to happen rather than planning immediate action against us." The revelation that Sarah's tribal relatives were maintaining surveillance of his ranch created new questions about her current status and the effectiveness of the escape plan that had supposedly carried her to safety in Denver. If her own people were watching Thomas's property, it suggested either that she had not reached her intended destination or that circumstances had changed in ways that required ongoing monitoring of anyone connected to her flight from federal pursuit. Thomas's immediate concern was whether Sarah had encountered difficulties during her journey to Denver that had prevented her from achieving the safety and anonymity that their plan was designed to provide. Marcus Webb's freight wagon operation was reliable and experienced, but the risks inherent in transporting federal fugitives meant that even carefully planned escapes could fail due to unexpected complications or betrayal by people whose loyalty could not be guaranteed. The possibility that Sarah had been recaptured or had died during her escape attempt created guilt and anxiety that reminded Thomas of his helpless rage during Catherine's final illness. Once again, he faced the prospect of losing someone he cared about while being powerless to provide assistance or protection when it was most desperately needed. The protective instincts that Sarah's crisis had awakened would not be satisfied by uncertainty about her fate or passive acceptance of situations beyond his direct control. Jake's suggestion for resolving their uncertainty about the Lakota surveillance required courage and diplomatic skills that would test Thomas's commitment to the path he had chosen when he decided to help Sarah escape. Someone needs to approach them directly and find out what they want, Jake proposed during their discussion of possible responses to the situation. If they're Sarah's people and they're here because something happened to her, we need to know the truth so we can decide what to do about it. The diplomatic mission that Thomas undertook the following morning required him to venture alone into the forested hills where the Lakota warriors maintained their surveillance positions, trusting that Sarah's relatives would recognize his role in her escape and extend protection rather than treating him as an enemy. His isolation had not prepared him for face-to-face negotiations with people whose cultural background and immediate concerns were completely foreign to his experience. But his commitment to Sarah's welfare provided motivation that overcame uncertainty about proper protocols or potential dangers. The leader of the Lakota surveillance team was a warrior named Standing Bear, whose weathered features and commanding presence suggested extensive experience in situations where diplomatic and military considerations were inseparable. His initial response to Thomas's approach was cautious but not hostile, indicating awareness of the white man's role in Sarah's escape while maintaining readiness for immediate action if the encounter developed in threatening directions. "You are the one who helped our sister escape from the Blue Soldiers," Standing Bear said in careful English, his tone neither grateful nor accusatory, but simply factual. "We have watched your ranch to understand whether you remain a friend to our people or have become an enemy who would betray our sister's location for rewards offered by the white government." Thomas's reply required honesty about his motivations while demonstrating continued commitment to Sarah's welfare, despite the personal risks involved in maintaining such loyalty. "I helped Sarah because what was done to her family was wrong, and because the law failed to provide justice for those crimes. My assistance was not conditional on future benefits or dependent on avoiding personal consequences. I would make the same choice again, regardless of what it might cost me." Standing Bear's assessment of Thomas's sincerity was conducted through the kind of direct evaluation that frontier negotiations often required when cultural differences made traditional diplomatic protocols inadequate. The Lakota warriors studied Thomas's face and bearing with the intensity of someone whose survival had depended on accurately reading the intentions and character of people whose words might not reflect their true purposes or commitments. "Our sister sent us to watch over you because she believes the Blue Soldiers will return with questions about her escape," Standing Bear explained after completing his evaluation of Thomas's trustworthiness. "She escaped to safety as you planned, but she learned that federal officers suspect your involvement in her disappearance. She asked us to provide protection if enemies come seeking revenge, or if the government tries to punish you for the help you gave her." The revelation that Sarah had not only survived her escape, but had dispatched warriors to protect Thomas created emotions that he struggled to process or express adequately. Her concern for his welfare, demonstrated through considerable risk to people she cared about, represented the kind of loyalty and gratitude that Thomas had not experienced since Catherine's devotion during their marriage. The knowledge that Sarah valued his safety enough to expose her relatives to danger provided validation that their alliance had created genuine bonds rather than simple transactions based on mutual convenience. The morning that would forever change Thomas Mitchell's understanding of loyalty and family began with Standing Bear's urgent warning that federal marshals were approaching the ranch in force, their numbers and equipment suggesting a major operation designed to capture not just Sarah running Fox but everyone connected to her escape. The intelligence gathered by Lakota scouts positioned throughout the valley indicated that Marshal Harrison had returned with over 20 men, including specialists in tracking and wilderness pursuit, who were prepared for extended operations in hostile territory. The Blue Soldiers come with many horses and weapons, Standing Bear reported as he and Thomas met in the pre-dawn darkness near the creek that bordered the ranch property. They bring men who know how to follow old trails and find hidden signs. They also bring chains for prisoners and a wagon for those who will not walk to their justice. The ominous reference to prisoner transport indicated that federal authorities had moved beyond simple investigation to active preparation for arrests, based on evidence they believed would implicate Thomas in criminal conspiracy to harbor fugitives. The escalation from questioning to detention suggested that Marshal Harrison had discovered inconsistencies in the original investigation, or had received new intelligence that compromised the deception Thomas and his allies had maintained for 6 weeks. Standing Bear's tactical assessment of the approaching federal force revealed military experience that extended far beyond the guerrilla warfare typically associated with Native American resistance to westward expansion. They move in formation like soldiers who expect battle rather than like peace officers seeking to ask questions. Their advanced scouts check every building and hiding place, and they have men positioned to prevent escape in all directions. The description of professional military tactics being employed against Thomas's ranch represented a level of federal response that seemed disproportionate to the crime of harboring a single fugitive, suggesting either that Sarah's case had gained political significance beyond its original scope, or that authorities suspected the existence of a larger network dedicated to helping Native American fugitives evade capture and prosecution. Thomas's immediate concern was protecting Jake Richardson and the Lakota warriors whose presence on his property would create additional federal charges while exposing Sarah's relatives to capture or violence that could escalate into broader conflict between tribal communities and territorial authorities. The isolation that had once provided refuge from unwanted attention had become a trap that threatened everyone who had chosen to remain loyal to him, despite mounting dangers. "Jake needs to disappear before the marshals arrive," Thomas told Standing Bear as they developed emergency plans for protecting his allies. His knowledge of Sarah's escape could be used against him in federal court, and his presence here during a raid would make him an obvious target for arrest and interrogation. Standing Bear's response revealed the depth of planning that Sarah's people had undertaken to protect Thomas from consequences of his decision to help their sister escape federal pursuit. "Your friend Jake will be safe. Our warriors have prepared hiding places that the Blue Soldiers cannot find, and we have routes that will take him beyond their reach until this danger passes." The coordination required for Jake's evacuation demonstrated the sophisticated organization that the Lakota Band had developed for operations in territory dominated by hostile federal authorities. Within minutes of Standing Bear's signal, Jake Richardson was surrounded by warriors who guided him toward concealed positions in the mountainous terrain where federal forces would be unable to locate him, even with extensive search efforts and superior numbers. Thomas watched his loyal foreman disappear into the wilderness with a mixture of gratitude for the protection being provided and anxiety about facing the federal investigation alone, without the support of someone whose knowledge of ranch operations and frontier survival could prove invaluable during extended interrogation or detention. The isolation he had once cherished now felt like vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies whose resources and determination exceeded anything he had previously faced. Standing Bear's final instructions before withdrawing to positions where his warriors could observe the federal operation while remaining undetected revealed the extent of Sarah's concern for Thomas's welfare and her commitment to ensuring his safety despite the risks involved in protecting a white man from government prosecution. Our sister has asked us to keep you alive and free if possible, but she understands that the blue soldiers may be too strong for such protection. If they take you prisoner, we will follow and wait for opportunities to help you escape. The promise of ongoing protection provided comfort that was tempered by recognition that Lakota intervention in federal law enforcement operations could trigger broader conflicts that would endanger entire tribal communities while potentially escalating Thomas's legal problems beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. His decision to help Sarah had created consequences that extended far beyond his personal welfare to encompass people whose survival depended on avoiding confrontations with superior military forces. The arrival of Marshal Harrison's expanded force at the Mitchell Ranch occurred with overwhelming precision that left no doubt about federal intentions or the seriousness of charges being contemplated against Thomas and his associates. 23 federal officers surrounded the property with military efficiency, establishing perimeters that prevented escape while creating fields of fire that would enable them to suppress any resistance from well-armed defenders. Marshal Harrison's approach to the main house was conducted with ceremony that suggested official proceedings rather than routine investigation. His bearing and documentation indicating that Thomas faced formal accusations rather than additional questions about his former employees' activities. The marshal's expression combined professional satisfaction with personal vindication, suggesting that weeks of investigation had produced evidence that justified the resources being committed to this operation. Thomas Mitchell, Harrison announced as he mounted the steps to the veranda where Thomas waited with carefully maintained dignity. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to harbor a federal fugitive, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact of the crimes committed by Sarah Running Fox. You will be transported to Denver for trial before a federal magistrate, who will determine appropriate bail and scheduling for your case." The formal charges represented escalation that transformed Thomas from potential witness to criminal defendant, requiring legal representation and courtroom strategy that would determine whether his assistance to Sarah resulted in prison sentences that could destroy what remained of his life. The conspiracy charge was particularly ominous because it suggested federal authorities believed they could prove coordinated planning rather than spontaneous assistance provided during a crisis. Thomas's response to the arrest was carefully calculated to maintain dignity while avoiding statements that could complicate his legal defense during future proceedings. "I understand the charges, Marshal, though I maintain that my actions were motivated by humanitarian concerns rather than criminal intent. I will cooperate with the legal process while defending my right to provide assistance to someone who was seeking justice for crimes committed against her family." Marshal Harrison's reaction to Thomas's statement revealed the depth of federal commitment to prosecuting anyone connected to Sarah's escape, regardless of their motivations or the moral complexities surrounding her case. "Your humanitarian concerns don't override federal law, Mr. Mitchell. Sarah Running Fox is a wanted killer, and anyone who helped her evade capture shares responsibility for future crimes she may commit against innocent settlers." The philosophical debate about justice and legal obligation was interrupted by the practical necessities of conducting a thorough search of Thomas's property for evidence that could support federal charges while revealing the extent of any network that might have facilitated Sarah's escape. Marshal Harrison's men began systematic examination of the ranch buildings, documentation, and personal effects with the thoroughness of investigators who expected to find proof of extensive criminal conspiracy. The search of Thomas's house revealed the careful attention to maintaining Catherine's belongings exactly as she had left them, creating poignant evidence of grief that seemed inconsistent with the federal portrayal of Thomas as a calculating criminal who harbored dangerous fugitives for personal gain. The preserved bedroom, untouched sewing room, and carefully maintained personal effects spoke of a man whose motivations were shaped by loss rather than criminal ambition. One of the federal officers conducting the search paused while examining Catherine's photograph and personal letters, his expression suggesting recognition that Thomas's assistance to Sarah represented emotional rather than criminal decision-making. "Marshal, you might want to see this," the officer called, indicating documents that revealed the depth of Thomas's devotion to his deceased wife and the isolation that had characterized his existence before Sarah's crisis had forced him to choose between safety and moral action. Marshal Harrison's examination of Catherine's belongings and Thomas's correspondence created the first crack in his certainty about the criminal nature of Thomas's involvement in Sarah's escape. The evidence of profound grief and social withdrawal suggested that harboring a fugitive represented emotional impulse rather than calculated conspiracy, though such motivations would not necessarily provide legal defense against federal charges. Discovery of the root cellar that had concealed Sarah during her escape provided physical evidence that supported federal accusations, while revealing the sophistication of planning that had enabled her to evade capture despite intensive pursuit by experienced law enforcement officers. The hidden compartment and secondary exit demonstrated knowledge and preparation that contradicted Thomas's claims of spontaneous assistance provided during an unexpected crisis. This hiding place was prepared well in advance, Marshal Harrison observed as he examined the cellar's construction and concealment. Someone spent considerable time and effort creating a sanctuary that could hide fugitives from thorough searches. This kind of preparation indicates conspiracy rather than impulsive humanitarian assistance. Thomas's explanation of the cellar's original purpose as food storage during harsh winters provided plausible alternative interpretation of the evidence, though the secondary exit and sophisticated ventilation system suggested modifications that exceeded normal requirements for preserving supplies. The ambiguity of the physical evidence meant that Thomas's ultimate fate would depend on testimony and documentary proof rather than clear-cut criminal activity. The federal courthouse in Denver bore witness to one of the most unusual cases in territorial legal history, as Thomas Mitchell's trial began 3 months after his arrest, drawing attention from newspapers throughout the Western Territories and creating precedents that would influence future prosecutions of civilians who aided Native American fugitives. The courtroom was packed with spectators whose interests ranged from legal professionals studying federal jurisdiction to settlers seeking reassurance that harboring criminals would be punished regardless of the defendant's claimed humanitarian motivations. Judge Samuel Morrison presided over the proceedings with the gravity appropriate to a case that carried implications extending far beyond Thomas's individual fate to encompass broader questions about civilian obligations during conflicts between federal authorities and Native American communities seeking justice through extra-legal means. Morrison's reputation for fairness was balanced by his commitment to upholding federal law, creating uncertainty about whether sympathy for Thomas's motivations would influence legal interpretations of his actions. Federal prosecutor James Whitman presented the government's case with methodical precision, arguing that Thomas's assistance to Sarah Running Fox represented calculated conspiracy to obstruct justice rather than spontaneous humanitarian response to someone seeking help during a crisis. Whitman's opening statement emphasized the premeditated nature of the escape plan and the sophisticated deception that had misdirected federal resources while enabling a wanted killer to evade capture and continue threatening innocent settlers. The defendant claims his actions were motivated by sympathy for someone he believed was seeking justice, Whitman told the jury during his presentation of the charges. But the evidence will show that Thomas Mitchell's assistance to Sarah Running Fox was planned in advance, executed with professional competence, and designed to help a dangerous criminal escape accountability for the brutal murders of 7 innocent people, including children. The prosecution's strategy focused on portraying Thomas as someone whose grief had made him susceptible to manipulation by a cunning fugitive, who exploited his isolation and emotional vulnerability to gain access to resources and protection that enabled her continued evasion of federal pursuit. Whitman argued that Sarah's employment as Thomas's housekeeper represented reconnaissance rather than legitimate domestic service, allowing her to evaluate his property and character while preparing escape routes that would be activated when federal authorities inevitably discovered her location. Thomas's defense attorney, Margaret Fulton, was one of the few women practicing law in Colorado Territory. Her presence in the courtroom creating additional attention from spectators who were curious about female legal advocacy in cases involving moral complexity and federal jurisdiction. Fulton's reputation was built on successful defense of clients whose actions challenged conventional interpretations of legal obligation, making her uniquely qualified to argue that Thomas's assistance to Sarah represented moral courage rather than criminal conspiracy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Fulton addressed the court during her opening statement, "this case requires you to distinguish between technical violations of federal law and genuine criminal intent." Thomas Mitchell's actions were motivated by recognition that Sarah Running Fox was seeking justice for crimes that the official legal system had failed to address. His assistance represents the kind of moral courage that has always been necessary when legal institutions fail to provide protection for innocent victims. The defense strategy centered on exposing the broader context of violence and injustice that had created the circumstances, leading to Sarah's transformation from victim to fugitive, arguing that her actions represented justified response to systematic oppression rather than unprovoked criminal violence. Fulton's presentation would challenge the jury to consider whether citizens possessed moral obligations that transcended strict adherence to federal law, when that law failed to protect vulnerable communities from organized violence. The testimony phase of the trial began with Marshall Harrison's detailed account of the investigation that had led to Sarah's identification as a federal fugitive and the subsequent pursuit that had revealed Thomas's role in her escape. Harrison's professional demeanor and extensive documentation created compelling evidence of systematic law enforcement efforts that had been thwarted by deliberate obstruction rather than simple failure to cooperate with federal authorities. The defendant's assistance to Sarah Running Fox was not limited to failing to report her presence on his property. Harrison testified under direct examination by Prosecutor Whitman. Mr. Mitchell actively participated in creating false evidence of her escape route, provided resources that enabled her to evade capture, and coordinated with accomplices who facilitated her transportation to safety beyond our immediate reach. Margaret Fulton's cross-examination of Marshall Harrison focused on exposing the federal government's failure to investigate or prosecute the original crimes against Sarah's family that had motivated her transformation into a fugitive seeking personal justice. Fulton's questions revealed the systematic nature of violence against Native American communities and the legal system's reluctance to provide protection or accountability when such violence served the interests of westward expansion. Marshall Harrison, did you investigate the massacre of Sarah Running Fox's family that preceded her alleged crimes? Fulton asked during her cross-examination. Did federal authorities pursue charges against the settlers who killed her father and other tribal members, or was such violence considered acceptable as long as it targeted Native American communities? Harrison's responses revealed the uncomfortable reality that federal law enforcement had devoted significantly more resources to pursuing Sarah than to investigating the original crimes that had motivated her actions, creating moral inequity that supported Fulton's argument about the inadequacy of official justice mechanisms when dealing with violence against Native American communities. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence from Thomas's ranch included detailed analysis of the root cellar that had concealed Sarah during her escape, with federal investigators arguing that the sophisticated modifications to the hiding place demonstrated advanced planning that contradicted Thomas's claims of spontaneous assistance. Expert testimony about the engineering required for the secondary exit and ventilation system suggested professional knowledge that exceeded what could be accomplished during the brief period between Sarah's exposure and her successful escape. Thomas's own testimony represented the emotional centerpiece of the trial, as he described the isolation and grief that had defined his existence since Catherine's death, while explaining how Sarah's crisis had awakened protective instincts that had been dormant for years. His account of the moral reasoning that had led to his decision to help Sarah revealed character development that transformed him from passive victim of circumstances to active agent of justice despite personal costs. I spent 3 years hiding from life because losing Catherine made everything else seem meaningless, Thomas testified during Fulton's direct examination. Sarah's situation forced me to confront the choice between continued isolation and taking action to protect someone who needed help. I chose to help her because allowing her capture would have made me complicit in the same injustice that had already destroyed her family. Prosecutor Whitman's cross-examination of Thomas focused on challenging his characterization of Sarah as a victim rather than a criminal, emphasizing the brutality of her methods and the innocence of some of her targets while questioning whether personal grief justified deliberate obstruction of federal law enforcement. Whitman's strategy aimed to portray Thomas as someone whose emotional instability had made him vulnerable to manipulation by a dangerous fugitive. Mr. Mitchell, did Sarah Running Fox inform you that her victims included children who had no involvement in her family's deaths? Whitman asked during his aggressive cross-examination. Did she explain why justice required killing innocent people who happened to be related to or associated with the men she held responsible for her grievances? Thomas's response revealed the complexity of his moral reasoning and his continued commitment to the principles that had motivated his assistance to Sarah, despite learning additional details about her methods. Prosecutor Whitman, I learned about the full extent of Sarah's actions during your investigation, not before I decided to help her. But even knowing everything I know now, I believe that someone who was denied justice through legal channels had the right to seek it through other means. The testimony of Jake Richardson, who had been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation with federal prosecutors, provided crucial evidence about the planning and coordination that had enabled Sarah's escape while revealing the network of relationships that had made such assistance possible. Jake's reluctant cooperation with federal authorities demonstrated the pressure that had been applied to force testimony from people who remained sympathetic to Thomas and Sarah despite legal consequences. Mr. Richardson, did Thomas Mitchell ask you to help create false evidence of Sarah Running Fox's escape route? Prosecutor Whitman asked during Jake's testimony. Did he coordinate with you to mislead federal officers about the direction of her flight and the resources she had available for extended evasion? Jake's responses were carefully calibrated to provide the minimum cooperation required by his immunity agreement while avoiding unnecessary damage to Thomas's defense, though his acknowledgement of coordination and advance planning provided ammunition for federal arguments about conspiracy and deliberate obstruction of justice. The surprise testimony that transformed the trial's trajectory came from an unexpected source when Marcus Webb, the freight operator who had transported Sarah to Denver, voluntarily appeared in court to provide evidence that challenged federal assumptions about the network that had facilitated her escape. Webb's testimony revealed that his assistance had been motivated by personal conviction rather than criminal conspiracy, and that similar operations had helped numerous Native American fugitives escape prosecution for actions taken in response to violence against their communities. I've transported dozens of Native Americans who were fleeing federal prosecution for defending their families or seeking justice for crimes that the law ignored. Webb testified during Margaret Fulton's presentation of defense evidence. What Thomas Mitchell did for Sarah Running Fox represents the kind of courage that decent people show when legal institutions fail to protect innocent victims. Webb's revelation about the scope of underground assistance to Native American fugitives provided context that transformed Thomas's case from isolated criminal conspiracy to part of broader civilian resistance to federal policies that privileged settler violence while criminalizing Native American responses to such violence. The climactic moment of Thomas Mitchell's trial arrived when the courtroom doors burst open and 30 Lakota warriors entered in full ceremonial dress, their presence transforming the federal courthouse into something approaching a battlefield as spectators gasped and federal marshals reached for their weapons. Leading this unprecedented procession was Sarah Running Fox herself, walking with dignity despite her pronounced limp, her dark eyes scanning the courtroom until they found Thomas seated at the defendant's table beside his attorney Margaret Fulton. Judge Morrison's gavel echoed through the stunned courtroom as he attempted to restore order while federal officers positioned themselves to prevent any disruption of legal proceedings or threat to court security. The judge's expression revealed both fascination and concern at this dramatic interruption of federal court proceedings by people whose very presence represented challenges to the legal authority he was sworn to uphold. "This court will come to order," Judge Morrison declared, his voice carrying the authority of federal jurisdiction, while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation. "I will not allow disruption of these proceedings, regardless of the cultural or political motivations of any individuals who believe they have the right to interfere with the administration of justice." Sarah's response to the judge's warning was delivered in clear, precise English that demonstrated education and intelligence that contradicted federal characterizations of her as a savage killer motivated by primitive desires for revenge. Her bearing and articulation revealed someone capable of sophisticated reasoning about justice and legal obligation, challenging assumptions that had underlain the entire prosecution of Thomas's case. "Your Honor," Sarah said as she stepped forward, her warriors maintaining respectful positions behind her, "I have come to provide testimony that will reveal the truth about the events that led to Thomas Mitchell's prosecution. I ask permission to speak on behalf of someone who risked everything to protect me when the law failed to provide justice for my family's massacre." The request created a legal dilemma that had no clear precedent in federal court procedures, as Sarah's status as a wanted fugitive made her testimony inadmissible under normal circumstances while her voluntary surrender for the purpose of testifying on Thomas's behalf represented an act of courage that demanded judicial consideration. Judge Morrison's response would establish precedents, affecting future cases where moral obligation conflicted with strict legal procedure. Prosecutor Whitman's immediate objection to Sarah's testimony revealed federal anxiety about allowing someone they had portrayed as a dangerous criminal to present alternative narratives about her actions and motivations. "Your Honor, Sarah Running Fox is a federal fugitive wanted for multiple murders. Her presence in this courtroom represents contempt for legal authority, and her testimony would be both inadmissible and prejudicial to the fair administration of justice." Margaret Fulton's counterargument emphasized the fundamental principle that defendants possess the right to present evidence in their defense, including testimony from witnesses whose credibility might be challenged, but whose knowledge was directly relevant to the charges being considered. "Your Honor, my client faces federal prosecution based on his relationship with Sarah Running Fox. Surely he has the right to present testimony from the person whose circumstances motivated his actions." Judge Morrison's ruling represented a compromise that acknowledged both legal precedent and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought a wanted fugitive voluntarily into federal custody for the purpose of providing exculpatory testimony for someone who had risked prosecution to ensure her safety. The court will allow limited testimony from Sarah Running Fox regarding the specific events that led to Mr. Mitchell's alleged criminal conduct, with the understanding that such testimony does not grant immunity from prosecution for her own illegal crimes. Sarah's testimony began with a detailed account of the massacre that had destroyed her family and tribal community, providing context that federal prosecutors had deliberately omitted from their presentation of her case as simple criminal violence rather than justified response to systematic oppression. Her description of watching soldiers and settlers kill children, elderly people, and peaceful families created emotional impact that transformed the courtroom's understanding of her subsequent actions. My father was a peace chief who sought accommodation with white settlers rather than warfare that would endanger our people, Sarah testified, her voice steady despite the obvious pain of recounting traumatic memories. He was killed while sleeping in his own lodge by men who celebrated his death as a victory over hostile Indians, though he had never raised weapons against anyone who was not threatening our families. The detailed account of federal and civilian violence against Sarah's people revealed the systematic nature of oppression that had created the circumstances, leading to her transformation from peaceful tribal member to someone seeking personal justice through methods that the legal system condemned as criminal. Sarah's testimony exposed the moral complexity that federal prosecutors had attempted to obscure by focusing exclusively on her actions while ignoring their context. Her description of Thomas's assistance was delivered with gratitude and respect that contradicted prosecutorial characterizations of their relationship as manipulation of a grief-stricken widower by a cunning criminal. Sarah's account revealed genuine partnership between two people who had found common cause in resistance to injustice, creating bonds that transcended racial and cultural differences, while serving moral purposes that official legal institutions had failed to address. Thomas Mitchell saved my life not because I deceived him about my identity, but because he recognized that someone seeking justice deserved protection from a legal system that criminalized my efforts while ignoring the crimes committed against my family, Sarah testified during Margaret Fulton's direct examination. His courage in helping me represents the kind of moral leadership that has always been necessary when legal institutions fail to serve justice. Prosecutor Whitman's cross-examination of Sarah focused on the brutality of her methods and the innocence of some of her victims, attempting to undermine sympathy for her circumstances by emphasizing the calculated nature of her revenge and the suffering she had inflicted on families whose only connection to her grievances was association with the men she held responsible for her losses. Miss Running Fox, did your quest for justice require killing children who had no involvement in your family's deaths? Whitman asked during his aggressive questioning. Did your moral principles justify murder of innocent people whose only crime was being related to or associated with the men you sought to punish? Sarah's response revealed the depth of her moral reasoning and the painful choices she had faced when seeking justice through extra-legal means after legal institutions had failed to provide accountability for crimes against her people. Prosecutor Whitman, I killed no one who was innocent of participation in or celebration of my family's massacre. Every person who died at my hands had taken part in killing my relatives or had profited from violence against Native American communities. The revelation that Sarah's victims had been carefully selected based on their specific involvement in violence against her people rather than chosen randomly for racial or political reasons provided new perspective on her actions while challenging federal characterizations of her methods as indiscriminate terrorism rather than targeted justice-seeking. Her testimony revealed sophisticated moral reasoning that contradicted assumptions about primitive revenge motivations. Standing Bear's testimony as leader of the Lakota warriors who had protected Thomas during federal investigation provided additional context about the broader Native American community support for civilians who demonstrated courage in protecting tribal members from unjust persecution. His account of coordinated efforts to ensure Thomas's safety revealed the extent of Native American commitment to honoring those who had proven themselves allies during times of crisis. In our tradition, a man who protects one of our people becomes part of our family, with obligations and protections that last for life. Standing Bear testified through a translator, his words carrying the weight of cultural authority that transcended legal jurisdiction. Thomas Mitchell earned such protection through his courage in helping our sister when she needed sanctuary from enemies who sought to punish her for seeking justice. The cultural testimony about Native American concepts of family and obligation provided the jury with alternative frameworks for understanding Thomas's actions as part of honored traditions of protection and mutual aid rather than criminal conspiracy against federal authority. Standing Bear's explanation of tribal values revealed sophisticated social systems that prioritize community welfare over individual safety or legal convenience. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on maintaining distinctions between cultural traditions and legal obligations, arguing that sympathetic motivations could not justify deliberate violation of federal law or obstruction of legitimate law enforcement activities. Prosecutor Whitman emphasized that legal systems required universal application regardless of defendants' personal beliefs about the adequacy or fairness of official justice mechanisms. The defendant's cultural sensitivity and humanitarian concerns are admirable, Whitman argued during his closing statement, but they do not grant him the authority to decide which federal laws he will obey and which he will violate based on his personal assessment of their fairness or adequacy. Margaret Fulton's closing argument challenged the jury to consider whether moral courage sometimes required civilians to choose justice over law when legal institutions failed to protect innocent victims from systematic violence. Her presentation emphasized that Thomas's actions represented the kind of principled resistance that had always been necessary to challenge unjust policies and protect vulnerable communities from oppression. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Fulton concluded her defense, this case requires you to decide whether decent people possess the right and obligation to protect innocent victims when legal institutions fail to provide adequate protection. Thomas Mitchell's courage in helping Sarah Running Fox represents the best of American values, the willingness to risk personal safety to defend justice and human dignity. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 days, during which Sarah remained in federal custody while her warriors maintained vigil outside the courthouse, their presence serving as a reminder of the broader communities whose interests were affected by the verdict in Thomas's case, the verdict that would determine Thomas Mitchell's fate and establish precedents for civilian resistance to unjust federal policies was delivered in a packed courtroom where tensions between legal authority and moral obligation had reached their breaking point. Judge Morrison's expression as he prepared to receive the jury's decision revealed the weight of presiding over a case that would influence future relationships between federal law enforcement and communities seeking justice through extralegal means. The jury foreman, a middle-aged merchant named William Crawford, whose weathered face spoke of years spent navigating the moral complexities of frontier life, rose to address the court with obvious awareness that his words would be scrutinized by legal scholars and political leaders throughout the territories. His bearing suggested someone who had wrestled seriously with questions that transcended simple application of legal precedent to encompass fundamental issues of human obligation and social justice. Your Honor, Crawford began, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to a decision that had required 3 days of intense deliberation among 12 citizens whose backgrounds and beliefs had initially seemed irreconcilable. We, the jury, have reached a verdict in the case of the United States versus Thomas Mitchell. The pause that followed seemed to last forever as Thomas sat beside Margaret Fulton, his hands clasped tightly while he prepared to learn whether his choice to protect Sarah would result in federal imprisonment or vindication of the moral principles that had motivated his transformation from isolated widower to active defender of justice. Sarah's presence in the courtroom, flanked by federal marshals but supported by the silent strength of her warriors, provided visual reminder of the human Stakes involved in the legal proceeding. On the charge of conspiracy to harbor a federal fugitive, Crawford continued with deliberate precision. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs as the first charge was dismissed, though the verdict on conspiracy left 2 additional charges that could still result in significant prison sentences if the jury had distinguished between different aspects of Thomas's assistance to Sarah. Margaret Fulton squeezed Thomas's hand as they awaited the resolution of charges that could separate them for years, despite partial vindication of his actions. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the foreman announced after consulting his notes, "We find the defendant not guilty." The dismissal of the second charge created broader excitement among spectators who recognized that Thomas's chances for complete acquittal had improved dramatically with the jury's rejection of federal arguments about criminal intent and deliberate interference with law enforcement activities. Standing Bear and his warriors maintained stoic composure, but their relief was evident in subtle changes of posture that suggested the outcome they had hoped for was becoming increasingly likely. On the charge of accessory after the fact to crimes committed by Sarah Running Fox, Crawford concluded with the solemnity appropriate to a decision that would establish legal precedents affecting future cases involving civilian assistance to Native American fugitives. We find the defendant not guilty. The complete acquittal transformed the courtroom into celebration as supporters cheered while federal prosecutors struggled to conceal their disappointment at the jury's rejection of charges that had seemed supported by overwhelming evidence of Thomas's involvement in Sarah's escape. Judge Morrison's gavel restored order, but the emotional impact of the verdict had already established that 12 ordinary citizens had chosen moral courage over strict legal compliance when forced to evaluate Thomas's actions. Judge Morrison's comments following the verdict revealed judicial recognition that the case had raised fundamental questions about the relationship between legal obligation and moral duty that extended far beyond Thomas's individual circumstances to encompass broader issues of civilian responsibility when legal institutions failed to protect innocent victims from systematic violence. The jury's verdict reflects their conclusion that Thomas Mitchell's actions were motivated by humanitarian concern rather than criminal intent, Judge Morrison observed as he prepared to dismiss the charges. While this court cannot endorse civilian interference with federal law enforcement, the jury's decision suggests that citizens retain the right to provide assistance to those seeking justice when legal institutions have failed to address legitimate grievances. The judicial commentary provided implicit criticism of federal policies that had prioritized prosecution of Native American resistance while ignoring the original violence that had motivated such resistance, creating moral inequities that citizens like Thomas had felt obligated to address through personal action, despite legal risks. Morrison's words suggested that the trial had exposed systemic failures that required policy changes rather than simply criminal prosecutions. Sarah's immediate fate following Thomas's acquittal remained uncertain, as her voluntary surrender for the purpose of testifying had not resolved the federal charges that had made her a fugitive for over 3 years. Her presence in federal custody created opportunities for either continued prosecution or negotiated resolution that might acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated her transformation from peaceful tribal member to someone seeking personal justice. Federal prosecutor Whitman's response to the verdict revealed bureaucratic recognition that continued pursuit of Sarah would be complicated by public sympathy generated during Thomas's trial and by evidence that had exposed the broader context of violence and injustice that had shaped her actions. The prosecutor's announcement regarding future proceedings reflected political calculations that extended beyond simple law enforcement to encompass territorial relationships with Native American communities. The federal government will review Sarah Running Fox's case in light of testimony presented during Mr. Mitchell's trial, Whitman announced to assembled reporters following the verdict. While her voluntary surrender demonstrates respect for legal authority, the serious nature of her alleged crimes requires careful consideration of all factors before determining appropriate prosecutorial action. The announcement suggested that federal authorities were seeking face-saving mechanisms that would avoid the political embarrassment of prosecuting someone whose actions had been portrayed as justified response to systematic oppression, while maintaining credibility of legal institutions that required consistent application of criminal law regardless of defendants' motivations or circumstances. Margaret Fulton's post-trial comments emphasized that Thomas's acquittal represented broader vindication of civilian rights to provide humanitarian assistance to those seeking justice when legal institutions failed to address legitimate grievances. Her analysis of the verdict's implications suggested that the case had established precedents that would influence future prosecutions involving moral conflicts between legal obligation and human duty. This verdict demonstrates that American juries retain the wisdom to distinguish between criminal conspiracy and moral courage. Fulton told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Thomas Mitchell's acquittal sends a clear message that citizens possess both the right and the obligation to protect innocent victims when legal institutions fail to provide adequate justice. The resolution of Sarah's federal charges came through negotiations that reflected political recognition that continued prosecution would create martyrdom while failing to serve legitimate law enforcement interests. The agreement reached between defense attorneys and federal prosecutors represented compromise that acknowledged both the seriousness of her actions and the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated her transformation into a fugitive seeking personal justice. Under the negotiated settlement, Sarah would plead guilty to reduced charges of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution in exchange for a sentence of time served plus community service involving education about peaceful resolution of conflicts between Native American communities and territorial authorities. The agreement avoided the spectacle of additional trials while providing face-saving mechanisms for federal prosecutors who needed to demonstrate that criminal actions carried consequences regardless of their underlying motivations. Thomas's return to his ranch occurred under circumstances dramatically different from the isolation that had characterized his existence before Sarah's crisis had forced him to choose between safety and moral obligation. The trial had created public recognition of his courage, while establishing relationships with people whose commitments to justice transcended racial and cultural boundaries that had previously defined territorial social structures. The Lakota warriors who had protected Thomas during federal investigation remained on his property as permanent guardians, whose presence represented ongoing tribal commitment to honoring someone who had proven himself worthy of protection through his actions, rather than his heritage. Standing Bear's establishment of a permanent camp near the ranch created unprecedented cooperation between white and Native American communities based on mutual respect rather than legal coercion or economic convenience. Jake Richardson's return to the ranch brought restoration of practical partnership that had been interrupted by federal investigation, though their relationship had been transformed by shared experience of resisting unjust authority, while protecting someone whose circumstances had demanded moral courage despite personal risks. Jake's immunity agreement had protected him from prosecution while creating obligations to federal authorities that would influence future decisions about assistance to fugitives seeking sanctuary. The transformation of Thomas's ranch into a sanctuary for people seeking justice or refuge from persecution represented evolution of his personal healing into community service that honored Catherine's memory while creating meaning from the grief that had once paralyzed him. The skills he had developed during his business career found new purpose in coordinating assistance for Native American families displaced by federal policies while maintaining legal relationships with territorial authorities. Sarah's periodic visits to the ranch during her community service created opportunities for continued Friendship between people whose crisis forged bonds had transcended the employer-servant relationship that had initially brought them together. Her recovery from the physical and emotional wounds inflicted by years of pursuit and hiding paralleled Thomas's emergence from grief-induced isolation into active engagement with causes larger than personal comfort or security. The letter that Thomas wrote to Catherine's grave on the first anniversary of Sarah's escape revealed the depth of his transformation from isolated widower to someone whose life had found renewed purpose through service to others seeking justice. When legal institutions failed to provide adequate protection or accountability. "My dearest Catherine," he wrote in careful script, "I believe you would be proud of the man I have become through choosing courage over comfort when someone needed protection. The grief that once consumed me has been transformed into strength that serves others who face injustices similar to those that took you from me. Sarah's courage in seeking justice for her family taught me that love requires action rather than simple remembrance, and that your memory is best honored through service to those who need the kind of protection I was unable to provide for you." The final scene of Thomas's story unfolded 5 years later as he stood beside Sarah and Standing Bear, watching children play in the yard where federal marshals had once searched for evidence of criminal conspiracy. The mixed community of white and Native American families that had grown around his ranch represented living proof that justice and healing were possible when people chose moral courage over convenient compliance with systems that failed to serve human dignity and protection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.